Okay, what's good? It's your favorite nerd, your boy Mondo. I'm really tired. I should be in bed, but I've been thinking about this, so I'm gonna one take Jake this sucker, and I'm gonna talk about this because it's something I'm thinking about. So I saw this article earlier today that I've pulled up on Ars Technica about the recently announced at CES RX 6500 XT, and this sucker has a problem, and it's that it's focused at non-mining purposes. Now, that in itself is not a problem. That's, the idea there is to redirect supply to gamers, to general consumers. The problem is that the way that AMD has gone about this is kind of weird. So NVIDIA's LHR thing, their low hash rate approach, is literally just like BIOS level limiters on Ethereum mining and other stuff like that. And so what ends up happening is that the cards are actually physically capable of mining at a certain hash rate and whatever, but it's limited by the firmware, and like they claim it's in the silicon too, but I don't really buy that. So it's not actually something the user can configure or something that affects performance in any other way. So the LHR cards are sort of supposed to be identical to non-LHR cards, except that, well, they're bad at mining specifically. AMD here has gone with a different approach for the 6500 XT specifically. So it's their most recently announced card in the RDNA 2, 6000 series GPUs, and it's their budget option. So it's supposed to retail, I think, for $200. And I'm just going to read the article verbatim because I read this a couple hours ago and I'm exhausted. And then I'm going to give my thoughts. So here we go. It's titled RX 6500 XT is bad at cryptocurrency mining on purpose, AMD says. And it reads, AMD will begin selling its latest budget GPU, the 6500 XT, on January 19th. Its retail price is $199, but ongoing GPU shortage, caused in part by cryptocurrency miners and scalpers who are snapping up every card they can get, has made it mostly impossible to get any graphics card at its list price over the past year. Whether the 6500 XT will be any different depends partly on supply, but AMD has also apparently designed the card to make it deliberately less appealing to miners while retaining its usefulness as an entry-level graphics card. Speaking to journalists in a press roundtable earlier this week, AMD Radeon VP Laura Smith talked about how the 6500 XT has been, quote, optimized for games. A transcript from now apparently deleted PC World article is preserved here. We have really optimized this one to be gaming first at the target market, Smith said. And you can see that with the way we configured the part. Even the 4 gig frame buffer, that's a really nice frame buffer size for the majority of AAA games, but it's not particularly attractive if you're doing blockchain type activities or mining activities. So I'm going to interject here and give some thoughts. So this is a really interesting and carefully worded statement because they're sort of spinning a for modern times pretty low frame buffer, actually 4 gigs, as a positive. And so 6 gigs has been the baseline for budget cards for this generation, and even for last generation, so we're talking RX 5000 and Turing, so 20 series GPUs, the lowest we went was 4 gigs on the frame buffer in comparison to last gen, where it went as far down as 2 gigs on the frame buffer and so on. And so for this generation, the farthest we had gone down before the 6500 XT, and I think the 3050 is doing it too, but we were 6 gig frame buffers and higher across the board. And so the reason that's important is, so the amount of VRAM you have directly correlates with specifically for gaming, the texture streaming capabilities of the graphics card. So a lot of graphical elements are physically rendered by the GPU, but when you're loading in textures, like just the 2D images that you're applying to the models, those are very memory heavy, to my understanding. This is a very basic rundown, just based on kind of what I know. And so basically higher the resolution of the textures, the more data you're moving per texture, the more VRAM you need, the bigger frame buffer, so that you can load up, queue up these frames essentially in the rendering process so that they can appear on screen and be high resolution. And so if you fill up that frame buffer, you exceed your VRAM, your system will default to pushing the overflow into your system memory, and it'll all bottleneck and slow down, and then you'll get some really bad stutter specific to filling up your VRAM budget. And the solution to that is lowering your game's resolution or your texture resolution if you have the option. And so the reason 6 gigs is really appealing is because resolutions have been increasing across the board. 4K is a more popular number. 1440p is really picking up steam. And even at 1080p, if you want to stream ultra textures at 1080p, you're going to need more, a larger frame buffer. And so coming from the last couple of generations where the baselines were 2 gigs, 4 gigs, and now 6 gigs, 6 gigs is actually a big enough frame buffer that for most purposes, general users won't fill it up unless they're like cranking their settings to ultra, in which case then they're facing other bottlenecks that aren't related to memory. And so the reason 4 gigs is not as good is just, it's just less. So even though this memory might be a little bit faster than last gen or whatever, which helps with like throughput in general, it's not going to be as capable at higher resolutions and that kind of stuff, and with higher texture resolutions. But what's important to note is specifically that this statement, it's a nice frame buffer size for a majority of AAA games. I think what they mean by this is that they're sort of trying to make it. They're trying to sort of explain that 4 gigs still works, which like is totally true, but it really it works for the most popular games. So you look at your like Twitch top 15 games or whatever, and half of them are like esportsy titles that aren't that visually demanding anyway. If you're talking Valorant, League of Legends, Apex Legends, CS:GO, Dota, like all these kinds of games, like they don't actually use that much in terms of really any system resources, and so you can kind of run them on anything, and so they will run. They are AAA games that will run fine on a 4 gigabyte frame buffer. But I think the meaning of AAA games has sort of shifted to kind of be whatever is appropriate for what you're talking about. And so if you mean like Metro Exodus, like it'll run at like low to medium settings, and God forbid you turn ray tracing on because it will crumple this GPU core. So yeah, I guess like 4 gigs is enough, but it's nothing special. And for a budget part, that's fine, but they do have to sort of cover their butts here because 6 gigs was like standard. But then this is the key phrase here right after, but it's not particularly attractive if you're doing blockchain type activities or mining activities. Reason being, probably the most popular mining purpose for these GPUs is Ethereum mining. And Ethereum specifically is a coin that as of late has been updated to require a 6 gigabyte or greater frame buffer. Ethereum is very heavy on VRAM, on the frame buffer. So having 6 gigabytes is now like the minimum. You can't mine Ethereum on anything that has less than 6 gigabytes because it's not capable for whatever reason. I don't know the specific reasoning. So it being 4 gigabytes means that it is immediately ineligible for Ethereum mining, which is a good thing because it means that it just won't be that appealing for miners, and so that sort of moves that group of like scalpers out of the way for potentially more availability for consumers. But here's the tricky part, so let's finish reading the article. Indeed, if you look at the spec sheet of the 6500 XT, you'll notice a few things that stick out compared to the last-gen 5500 XT. For starters, there isn't an 8GB version of the 6500 XT. The 6500 XT also uses a 64-bit memory interface, which is exceedingly rare in modern GPUs. You'll sometimes see it in a low-end dedicated laptop GPU like the MX450, but discrete GPUs released within the last couple of generations have mostly stuck to 128-bit memory interfaces at a minimum. Both of these decisions make the 6500 XT bad for Ethereum mining in particular, since it needs more than 4 gigabytes of video RAM and really likes memory bandwidth, like I said. To make up for the slower memory interface, and to help the card compete with the RX 570 class of cards that AMD wants it to replace, AMD has boosted the clock speed of the 6500 XT way up. Its maximum boost frequency is 2815 MHz, up from 1845 in the RX 5500 XT. Even the top tier 6900 XT only boosts to 2250 MHz. It just has a lot more GPU hardware and much more memory bandwidth to work with in the first place. NVIDIA has also taken steps to limit its GPU's mining capabilities with LHR. They go on to talk about LHR a little bit. Let's see, the 6500 XT shouldn't have these problems. It's generally not possible to hack more video RAM onto a graphics card. What remains to be seen is whether the design decision to make the 6500 XT suboptimal for mining also makes it suboptimal for gaming. So, this is a big deal. This is something I've never seen in a big-time graphics card. This is the kind of compromise you see in like a low-tier made for straight to business deployment kind of card, like the GT 710 or the 730 or even the 1030. So it's this memory bus limitation. It's the 64-bit memory interface. I can't name a card aside from maybe an older like a 710 that has a 64-bit memory interface. That's really narrow. So to my basic understanding, that's essentially like the available bandwidth per cycle for the memory that you have to like process anything. And so narrower memory interface generally means less overall bandwidth regardless of like memory speed. And that's why here they have to overcompensate with the clock speed on the card. 2815 megahertz is nuts. That's really high. Almost 3 gigahertz on a GPU core, again, is something I've literally never seen. They even say the 6900 XT only boosts to 2250 megahertz. I think the freaking RX, or the RTX 3090, I think only boosts to like 2500 megahertz, maybe. And that might be on like some super overclock card. That's off the top of my head. I remember last generation, the 2080 Ti, I think, could hardly even break 2 gigahertz. And they're all different architectures. But it's just like sometimes these numbers sort of mean something in terms of like how high you've gone in terms of like when you see like an article of like, oh, someone reached 5 gigahertz or 6 gigahertz or 7 gigahertz. It's just a big number. It's not something you usually see for consumer platforms, even though platform to platform you can't compare them too well. So that's why I think it's really good they bring up the 6900 XT, because this is AMD's highest tier card. It is their 3090 essentially, and it performs as such. It is more powerful than a 3080, not quite as powerful as a 3090, but slightly cheaper to compensate. And yeah, it's 2250 megahertz, but it has a lot more GPU hardware and much more memory bandwidth, they say, and that's true. It's a 128-bit or I think maybe even 256-bit memory interface, and then they have like their infinity cache thing on the 6900 XT. The core is like massive and it's much more powerful. So I think this is a weird compromise for them to make. And also, yeah, over the last gen offering, the 5500 XT, which the 5000 series was first generation RDNA, so there have been some architectural improvements that let them boost the clocks, but a whole gigahertz, I guess. That's a lot that from one generation to the next. And yeah, it's important because the 5500 XT, a high-end 5500 XT, could have an 8 gigabyte memory buffer and a frame buffer and a 120-bit memory interface, because AMD, at least up until now, would always offer their budget or like consumer-focused cards with 2 memory options. I think they did it as far back as like the R9 series, but the first time I can remember, like for sure, was the like RX 400 series. You could get an RX 480 that I think had like 4 gigs or 8 gigs, and they do this because it's easier. You can expand your product stack without actually having a different product, so the core can stay the same, but you just give consumers different memory configs and they can pick the card they need there. So there's not even an option on the 6500 XT for more memory than 4 gigs. So yeah, like I said, like this is really good theoretically in that it has the potential to bring a lot of supply because it's less memory to manufacture. So you can put more, like you with the same amount of memory chips, you can create more cards. It's their lowest end core, so theoretically it's easier to manufacture. It's a low power part, so the power circuitry and the filtration doesn't have to be all that sophisticated. like it's generally like a pretty solid idea. What the two things that sort of scare me about this are the 64-bit memory bus and this super high frequency. Like, how stable is this 2815 megahertz? How often is it going to downclock itself? How often are AIB cards going to go below this mark? And what does the 64-bit memory interface even look like in games? Like, because we don't know what that looks like. The 64-bit memory interface is usually tied in with an old platform, with old memory, and an old core that can't keep up with games for other reasons. So on a new platform, even for it being a budget card, on a new platform with a new core, with fast memory, with new drivers, how does a constrained memory bus like perform? And I think, you know, people like Gamers Nexus and Digital Foundry are probably gonna get really into the weeds on that and like test very memory specific scenarios and find like the unequivocal, like, here's the actual direct comparison. But what I'm more concerned with is gaming, because, you know, it's a gaming focused card, as they say, and like, what does it actually look like in modern games for you to not have memory bandwidth? Like, something I think about in terms of like memory constraints from the last couple of years was back when like, I think it was 2017, so before the 20 series, Digital Foundry made a video comparing the GTX, the 1066 gig and the 1063 gig to a China-specific version of the 1050 that was the 1054 gig. So the 1050 was a 2 gigabyte card, and so the stack there was 1050 2 gigabyte card, 1050 Ti 4 gigabyte card, and then there were two models of the 1060, one that was a 3 gigabyte model and one that was a 6 gigabyte model. The problem between the 6 gigabyte and the 3 gigabyte was that they were not the same card. So it was not the same card with two different memory configurations. The 1063 gig was actually a lower end card than the 1060. Like, they had different GPU cores aside from the different memory configuration. The 1054 gig, if memory serves, was a weird hodgepodge of configuration because it had as much memory as the 1050 Ti, but it had the GPU core that I believe the 1063 gig had. So it was more performant than the 1060, or rather, it was not as performant as the 1066 gig because the core was not as powerful, but I believe it had less of a struggle with memory bandwidth stuff, so like texture filtering and texture quality, than the 1063 gig, because it was something along the line. Maybe it was like a 1050 or 1060 core. It was something like that, but it had some capability from it having a 4 gigabyte memory buffer that the 1063 gig could not match. And so I think of that, and I think, you know, how does this compare? Because, you know, this isn't a like a, it's not the amount of memory here that's the problem. It's the memory interface. So how does the 6500 XT compare to a 4 gig model of the 5500 XT? How does it compare to an RX 570 with 8 gigabytes? How, I think they even made 570s or 560s that had 4 gigabytes. How does it compare to that? How does it compare to the 1050 Ti? Like, we're getting into the weeds here, but like, what does it mean to have a 64-bit memory bus in terms of like actual games, like a real use case? And I have literally no idea. So that's why it's sort of permeated in my mind, because I genuinely have no clue what this is going to look like. And like, I think generally when a product comes out like this, you get a vague inkling of performance, just because it's like, oh, it's the lower end one, it's got these downgrades. But I've never seen the memory bandwidth downgrade. And even the 3050 I don't think has a 64-bit memory bus. I think the 3050 I think it hasn't been officially confirmed by NVIDIA, or like maybe it's just leaks, I'm not sure, because I really haven't been keeping up with the news cycle that well. But the 3050 I'm pretty sure is a 4 gig card as well, but I don't think it has, I think it's a 128-bit memory bus, and it's just an LHR card. So it's just made to not, like, it has NVIDIA's specific optimizations, or lack thereof, for cryptocurrency mining. Yeah, and so the 3050 you can sort of venture to guess, oh well, it'll probably be like 3060 performance, but like you have to turn the textures down because it has less VRAM, and like bring the quality down a bit and like maybe lower resolution. So, you know, and the 6500 XT, if you look at it from that lens, like it should be in the same ballpark as the 3050. It should be a downgrade from like the 6600 XT in that same sense. Theoretically, they're both budget focused 1080p cards for, you know, for the for like the most popular games, which, like, yeah, that's not an uncommon skew. It's just that I've never seen this specific approach. And also, what are the implications of such a high clocked core? Like I said, will it cause stability problems, or will it reveal a potential like increase in what we can look for clock speeds on RDNA 2? Like, I'm, you know, because normally you see a card clocked like to the farthest of its limit when it's the high-end card. So you can bet with some certainty that if you buy a 3090 or a 6900 XT, that the factory overclock is just about as high as it can go, and you're squeezing out, like, if you're trying to overclock it, you're squeezing out like single or double-digit megahertz of performance out of it, and you may be even causing stability problems. And that's not how it used to be, but lately, factory overclocking tools have just become better, and the manufacturers are more willing to sell a product that is pre-overclocked so that it can, you know, beat out the competitor. Because it's just something NVIDIA didn't have to used to do, and AMD like literally was not in a position to do. Their cards were all budget focused at a certain point, not so long ago. And NVIDIA, like the 1080 Ti, like you could get, I don't know, like 5% more performance out of it because like it was already a beast, and AMD had nothing even close to the 1080 Ti. And now, like, yeah, as soon as RX 5000, NVIDIA started playing it safe and just overclocking all their cards, and that, I don't know how that goes down the product stack. Like I think you can bet that if you go as far down as like 3070, that it'll still be overclocked just about as high as it'll go. But how does that look for the budget cards now? Because this card is supposed to be powered just by the PCI Express slot, so it's supposed to be a 75 watt card. So it shouldn't have much overclocking headroom in that sense, unless there's something here, like if they're really shooting for power efficiency for the cards that will be just powered on the PCI Express slot, you're probably going to get some board partners that build the card with a 6-pin power port anyway, and then who knows if it's actually like decent for overclocking. Like, can we get to 3 gigahertz on RDNA 2 already? And if so, like, does it even matter? Like, how much does this clock speed increase actually compensate for the memory bit width words? I'm getting really tired here, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like, doesn't matter, and we will see. My hope is that this works. I think if this strategy works, that it's a big deal, because this is a hard limit. This is a, like, built into, not even the silicon, this is built into, like, the architecture of the, like, board design of the memory controller. Like, it's a big deal. And so, like, NVIDIA's LHR stuff is, like, seems to be mostly BIOS level, which means technically, even though it's more, like, it's deeper into the system, harder to mess with, it's still technically a software limitation. This is a hard limitation. You will not be able to break the memory interface limitation on this card, period. And so that means it's not just unappealing for Ethereum mining because it can't do it. It also means it's unappealing for any kind of mining that has any kind of focus on memory, because it's going to be totally, like, limited either in any scenario. And it's really interesting to see such a stark contrast. Something that just came to mind was NVIDIA recently re-released the 2060, the RTX 2060, a last-gen low-end card, with a 12 gigabyte frame buffer or something like nuts like that, or it was like 8 gigs or something. It was nuts, because the 2060 originally came with I think a 6 gig memory buffer, if I remember correctly. And yeah, so it just got like doubled or something like that, which is crazy. That's a lot of memory for a card that low end. And like you can tell that card, that is appealing to miners, even though they say that it's not, even though they say it's a gaming focused card. Like, what are you going to do with 12 gigs in a 2060 core? The 2060 core cannot handle the amount of memory that a 12 gigabyte memory buffer can handle. 12 gigabyte memory buffer is like 8K stuff. The 2060 cannot play games at 8K. Like, the core it cannot keep up. It will be like 10 FPS at best. And again, don't you dare turn on ray tracing, because it'll buckle. It can't do it. So it's such a stark contrast to NVIDIA's like very blatant, like, okay, just get it out there. Like, no, AMD is like really thinking about this. And I wonder what the internal consensus is on mining, because it's weird, because there's a dilemma in that, like, consumers, like the general gaming populace, I guess, that is kind of trying to buy these cards, is opposed to mining in the sense that it's redirecting cards away from their purposes, but to the end, like, to NVIDIA, to AMD, they make the money either way, right? So how much do they actually want to make a stance on that? How much do they actually want to stop cryptocurrency miners from getting their hands on this stuff? Because at the end of the day, they make the money regardless of who gets their hands on it. And if anything, if scalpers and cryptocurrency miners can get their hands on these cards, they will take it away from NVIDIA or AMD faster than any normal person would, like than any, just person trying to get the drop at Best Buy, right? So I wonder how much they care, and maybe AMD is in a position to care, because they still, as much as they have changed their end product, they still generally carry a perception of like the underdog, even though, like, because NVIDIA's still got the best graphics cards in terms of just raw performance, and Intel is still the sort of behemoth that it is from it having been the de facto chip maker for so long. AMD still has this like ethos of being like for the little guys in certain aspects, especially in the graphics space. And so I wonder if this is a calculated move to appeal to gamers, and so that people can walk into the Best Buy and see the shelves filled with low-end AMD cards, and just not see any NVIDIA, because that matters. That, like, that's a big, it's influential because like people see that the card's even available, and they're like, wow, how'd they get these in stock? Like the example I think of is in the consoles right now. The only console of the next gen consoles that you could possibly fathom like walking into a store and seeing on the shelf is the Xbox Series S. That, I like, more than once I've walked into a store and seen like 3 of them on the shelf, and they don't last long, but the fact that they were there long enough for me to even see them and even like briefly consider buying them, that's a big deal when you can't even like buy a PS5, when you can't buy a Series X, and when they're not really offering the last gen consoles either. People are buying PS4s left and right too. So like, to be able to see a Series S, like, yes, you can make the argument that it's not selling in this high supply, and that might be true, but the Series S is also a higher volume item. Like, they can keep supply higher with the Series S, even if demand isn't higher. It means that their presence, their sort of brand presence is greater. And if AMD can capture that, if AMD can continue to like influence the desktop PC space, and also it's not just for enthusiasts or for personal builders. Like, these low end cards were also really focused for OEMs. So like, your Dell, your Lenovo, your HP, they want these low end cards because they're much easier to build systems in, because the OEMs are very, very bad at making good computers because it requires effort. And so what they want to do is set up the easiest possible, cheapest configuration to get customers in and out. Tack on a 3-year protection plan that they can't get out of, and off they go. And so having these high power parts that actually like need some maintenance, and that need to like have a thermal design in the case that isn't like completely garbage, it's not really their jam. So like these low end cards that they can throw in, they don't even need like secondary power from the power supply. Like this is what they are looking for, and so yeah, this is a big deal because it potentially means that in the low end AMD gets their footing back, because the low end sort of stopped existing the moment AMD started trying to get in the ring with NVIDIA again in the graphics space. For a couple of generations there, it was all just like refreshes of low end platforms, like the RX 400, RX 500 series were just refreshes of previous architectures, and they were made for the budget scenes. The RX 580, AMD's highest end offering for like a while, competed with the GTX 1060 in performance. The 1060 was NVIDIA's mid-range card for that generation. Their like performance cards were the 1070 and the 1080, and then their enthusiast cards was the 1080 Ti and the Titan. So AMD wasn't even competing at anything higher than mid-range, and then the moment AMD had something that they could really compete with in the form of the 5700 XT, now they were competing in like mid to high range. So the 5700 XT was matching the 2070 Super, which was like NVIDIA's third or fourth best card, and then NVIDIA starts trying to play that game so that their lowest end card is the 2060, and the 2060 is still is not really low end. NVIDIA did eventually bring around the 16 series, but the 16 series has not stood the test of time in terms of supply. The 16 series is like really still like just as hard to get as the 20 series. And then AMD sort of started making some stuff that was lower end in the 5000 series, like the 5500 XT there, but like it just didn't exist really. The supply for those cards was not very high. The supply for the like Halo product, the big cards, is higher because it sort of accentuates this presence of performance, of like dominance in the performance space, but it doesn't actually help the consumers that kind of just want to build the computer and go. So hopefully there's a shift here, because like, yeah, the pandemic has been going on for so long that at this point, like, we just need graphics cards that aren't scalped, hopefully, that are even purchasable, and that can play games, because you can't argue that being able to buy a GT 710 is graphics card availability when the 710 most of the time has a 1 gig frame buffer and can hardly boot like Minecraft without like having a hard time. That's also it's EOL, and they sell it as a new card. Like the last driver for the 710 was released in September, forever. Like that's the last driver NVIDIA is ever going to make for that card. So like, yeah, we need a new card on a new platform that's cheap, that's available. It doesn't matter if it's scalped a little bit. They say the MSRP, the retail price is going to be $200 right there. I'm betting right now that there's no way this card is a $200 card, but if it's a $300 card and I can go anywhere and buy it at $300, no questions asked, from a retailer, not from some scalper on eBay, I will give you $300 for me to be able to just buy it, and to be able to tell all my friends that they can just buy it, and to be able to build computers for customers because we can just buy it. I'll take it, because buying cards at scalper prices is not something I want to do. And buying any other card, if you want to buy them at MSRP, you have to catch certain drops, and then you're still buying them at like, they've been like tariff priced and, manufacturers scalped a little bit, so they're more expensive than they were at launch. And even when you get them, like they're in such low availability that it's like the 1 or 2 cards you were able to get in that span of like 6 weeks. It's a bad situation right now trying to get graphics cards. And for anyone who is even a little bit not in the know, they cannot get a graphics card. If they're not keeping up with drops, if they're not keeping up with those like streams that have just a command line of like of what all the latest drops are, like, you can't get one. All we need is for you to be able to walk in somewhere or log on to Amazon and just type in graphics card, have it show up at the top of the menu, be available for prime shipping, next day shipping, and just go. I don't care if it's $100 above MSRP. I just want to be able to buy it. And like, yeah, and part of the problem is just scalpers, because like cryptocurrency miners kind of like started this wave, even as far back as like 2018. But what has kept it going is the supply shortage, and so removing appeal from the high-end people, removing appeal from the cryptocurrency miners, and even it just being such a low-price card, it's not very appealing for scalpers because it's a low-end card, so they can't actually scalp it for that much. For a 3090, you can scalp the 3090 like crazy, especially if it's non-LHR, because it's in super high demand, super low supply. It's a really high performance card. It was expensive when you got it, so your markup can be nuts. Your markup can be hundreds or like $1,000. And if it's a low hash rate card, you can double that number. Or if it's not a low hash rate card, rather, you can double that number because you know you're going to be selling it to a cryptocurrency miner for the most part. Like, it just doesn't make sense for that to apply to a low-end card in the same way. So, like, some people will obviously try to pick up some of the low-end cards and scalp them a little bit, but it's not going to hold. Like, with console scalping, for example, I'm not sure if it's as bad now, but it's definitely still happening. With with a Series X or a PS5 of any flavor, they're $400 or $500, which means that you can scalp it for at least $100 more, if not as much as double, depending on how constrained the market is. I know that when the PS5 first came out, PS5s were selling for as much as like $1,200, $1,500, and that was a worst case scenario. But it's because it started at $400 or $500, so it wasn't uncommon for people to be buying them for like that was like the high end of how expensive they got. But people would buy them for like $700-800, literally doubling the price. Even if you double the price of something as low as like the Series S, though, the Series S retails for what, $300. If you double the price of the Series S, well, it's $600. Still expensive, but more manageable. But even then, it's like, well, I could get a Series X. Well, then, you want to lower the pricing there. $500, $450. Like, you're still scalping it, but it's not as scalpable because, like, your margins will be lower because your cost of entry was lower. I think that the scalping propagates the more expensive the product is and the more desirable it is. But the Series S is not as desirable. It's in higher demand, or it's in higher supply, rather. It's cheaper to begin with. Like, it's hard to scalp the Series S, and so I think it'll be harder to scalp these graphics cards, especially because they're not very well known either. The low end cards generally do not get as much love as the high end cards. Usually, in pre-COVID times, it was the mid range cards that got the most love. So like, you were looking at like RX 580, GTX 1060, and 1070. Those were like the most popular cards of that generation. And then all of a sudden, the focus gets on these high-end cards, and like the 2080 Ti, the 2080 are the big hitters of that generation. And so for this generation, it's been the 3090 and the 6900 XT because they're the biggest number. And AMD even has some meme potential in their flagship cards. So that meme potential genuinely helps. In like the eyes of the consumers, because it's like, haha, funny number, but then it gets them like they are now aware of your product, but yeah, the 6500 XT, it's not. This is not a big name item. There's a reason they announced this at like CES instead of their own event, because it's not that big a deal. CES means like. Literally every manufacturer for every type of tech is announcing like their broad, like, here's what we're doing for this year, kind of ish, and throwing some low end parts in there or some niche parts in there is a pretty good strategy, because that means if it sucks, it can sort of get swept under the rug, like with all the other cool stuff that came out around it. And if it's cool, then it'll get some media coverage for the week of CES, for the week of the event, and then go away with like little to no consequences either way. Ultimately, the 6500 XT has the potential to move mountains because it's like not that special. That's like kind of the point. And yeah, that's really it. I've been rambling a lot, and that's kind of the point of this. I told you I was half asleep. If anyone has cared to listen to this and is even still awake at this point, because I know I put you to sleep, let me know. Shoot me a hot comment, and let me know what you think about these low-end cards. or even if you care, because you might not, and that might actually be beneficial. So that's it. Yeah, I have real stuff, like real non-rant videos, like maybe probably happening soonish, maybe. But this is a lot easier to make just on the spot. So yeah, I'm gonna make another like super corny tier list soon. I'm gonna make a follow up to my operating system tier list, and so it was gonna be for the year of 2021, but I've been waiting on Samsung's One UI 4 skin for Android 12. And yeah, One UI 4 has had a very troubled rolling launch worldwide until like this week, when it's finally hitting the US and is stable and it's not crashing phones. So hopefully I can get One UI 4 very soon, give it a shot, give my take on it, and then I can add it to the operating system tier list, and then I'll make the video. So yeah, I hope you stick around for that one. Have a good night. I love you, and make sure not to put too much milk in your cereal bowl, because then it will overflow.